Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and I've got a bin down here in the lower left corner. That's a tray of European nightcrawlers that I've got basically composting my compostable kitchen scraps and paper and all kinds of other stuff. In fact, that's the same thing that's going on in all these containers. In the case of this bin right here, though, it's been 10 days since it was last fed, and I thought I would check in on it today and make sure that it's got enough food to keep going. Not to say that what was placed in there previously is gone already. There's probably going to be leftovers, but I always like to sort of stay ahead of the game on that. So we're going to be feeding that bin today. The food that I've got here for them is already out on the bench. It's a bag full of frozen fruits. It's basically apple peels for the most part, and the peel of one banana. So besides the food, I've also got my little container of pulverized eggshell that we're going to include as the grit to go hand in hand with that feeding, maybe some bedding too. So let's get this system up on the bench and we'll talk more about it as we get to work on it. Usually when I put my bins out onto the bench, I don't worry too much in terms of which side is showing up as the top for you or the bottom for me or whatever the case may be, what's left or right. But in this case, I wanted to make sure I'm aligning the orientation of the bin with the illustration of the bin that I created to go hand in hand with my little intro. The system is 32 days of age and it's been fed 3 times now. This is going to be its 4th feeding, and I wrote it down because I just wanted to make sure I was accurately representing what has happened here so far. We've been doing kind of a unusual little feeding experiment in here. It's not really an experiment, it's just a pattern for the feeding, and basically it just means we're switching corners of the bin every time we feed. And the first time we fed was over here, and that's represented on the illustration here with the number 1. Down here in this corner, when we first fed, way in the beginning, the system had been built and sat for 7 days, and then came this first feeding. It had your typical kitchen scraps in it, and vegetable and fruit bits, and maybe some coffee, maybe some bedding. But the one weird out of the ordinary thing that was placed into that corner back then, which at this point would be 25 days ago, mashed potatoes. And I think on each subsequent check-in, we've looked in there and found some remnants of that. I'm wondering if we're still going to see leftover mashed potato down here. Here, in this corner, we placed an interesting item. It's the entire stem of a pumpkin, kind of oriented with the fleshy part of the pumpkin over in this corner, for the worms to nibble on with the stem pointing inwards, which probably won't get too much attention, but we'll see. And then the last feeding, which occurred at this point 10 days ago, was over here, and it's represented as just being sort of a typical mix of vegetables out of my freezer, probably coffee, probably some grit, maybe a little bedding, but I think the one thing in there was a good bit of carrot peels. So I think the carrot peels, there's probably not going to be a whole lot of leftovers of the carrot peels, especially after 10 days. Usually that's kind of a hot ticket item in the worm bins, fast food type of a thing, at least in my experience. My worms definitely seem to like it. So we'll see. We'll see how that stuff did after 10 days. You got to keep in mind that there's also, at this point, the leftovers of previous feedings over here that could be distracting the worm population from, attacking the most current feeding. So sometimes the progress of the most current feeding is subject to how many leftovers remain in the system, or maybe how recently the last feeding occurred. So it's kind of difficult to forecast what your worm's going to do. How do you like that? I don't know if you could see that. I'm going to try to zoom in the video when I edit this so you can probably see it a little bit better. Here's 2 worms kind of head to head, and this jumble right here in the middle is where they're sort of overlapping and connected to one another in the process of mating. Always a great thing to see in your worm bins. And you know what? How do you like that? There's another example of it right there. If I keep taking off coverings, I wonder if we'll see even more examples of it. There probably are other examples of it, but it's kind of neat to open up your bin and find 2, mating sessions in progress. So I think that's a good sign. It tells us that the worms are enjoying the home we built for them. So once again, feedings 1, 2, and 3 have been set up in this clockwise fashion, leading us to the final unfed corner of the bin, which is where we're going to place today's feeding. And when I look at what I bought down here for them, it just seems like a really large amount of food. But you know what? I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to just give it to them all, and it'll take as long as it takes to for them to eat it, you know. Apple, I know, is sort of a slow composting item, and if we keep up this pattern of switching corners every 7 to 10 or more days, at this point, who knows how long the next interval will be. It could be a month and a half before we return to that corner, at which point the apple might be gone or mostly gone. But all right, so let's go through this really quick. Before we open up the hole and drop in the feeding, let's just really quickly do a little time warp. 25 days ago, this relatively routine feeding included some weird food, mashed potato. I'm curious to see if there's any leftovers of it. Whatever the reason is, the worms are still feeling quite at home in this corner of the bin. So there's a good number of them hanging out here. I don't remember if we did a really significant upturn of this corner last time. I think I might have tried to take a somewhat non-invasive approach to seeing what was happening here, but today I figured we would just do a sort of a deep dive to see how things look. And you can see this is a pretty densely populated corner with what appears to be leftover scraps of stuff. So like I said, besides the mashed potato, there were other routine elements added to this corner when it was fed. So there could have been stuff like a banana peel, other bits that take a little bit longer to break down. And I think we even went pretty generous on the bedding. There's like large chunks of cardboard in here and stuff. So here I'm seeing, I think, what might be a pretty good patch of leftover potato. Maybe it's still sticking around because it's attached to this piece of cardboard here. I would think that if we were to smear that stuff around a little bit, it would just have a much better chance at being broken down. To me, it always seems like anything that's kind of caught up in a big lump or a pile might have its outer portions approached and eaten, but if anything is sort of in the pile, I mean, there's no reason for the worm to burrow down into it if they can just nibble off a little bit right from the outer surface. So to me, it always seems like stuff's going to have a better chance of breaking down if it's spread around with the surrounding materials or the surrounding bedding usually. So you'll remember pumpkin stem here, and I could already feel I'm bumping into it. You could see right here where my finger is. This is the end of the pumpkin stem. So if we begin excavating, we're going to see how big this thing was. And wow, not bad. At this point, it does seem like they've nibbled the end of the pumpkin stem clean of any of the actual pumpkin, the meaty part of the pumpkin. And you can see this is a pretty good sized stem with a little passenger taking a little ride on the back of this thing. So it's pretty firm. Feels a little bit like wood that's been floating around in a river for a few months, kind of getting soft to the touch. This side's been exposed to the elements a little bit longer. This side was shielded by the vegetable itself. So it does seem like this stuff is starting to break down here. It even has some little burrows in it, so I wonder if there's worms hanging out down inside of that thing. But whatever, let's just take a quick peek at how the feeding in this corner is progressing. Here too, I think other than the pumpkin, the rest of the stuff placed in here at that time would have been somewhat routine. And I don't remember exactly what it was, but for some reason I think Brussels sprouts rings a bell. So it might have been a combination of pumpkin stem, Brussels sprouts, and at this point we can obviously tell banana peel. Banana peel is always kind of showing up in these feedings, as it's going to happen today. There is a little bit of a funny odor in this corner, and it doesn't smell too bad. It just smells different from your typical worm bin smell, because your typical worm bin smell is basically no smell. Here it does smell as if I'm sensing a little bit of the actual decomposing food, which is usually a little bit unusual because, you know, you would expect that either the microorganisms in the system or the worms or someone's busy breaking that stuff down and sort of suppressing the scent of it. And that seems to be the case in most situations. But I guess once in a while maybe there's sort of a material that kind of got jumbled up. Maybe there's a pile of it that just is sheltered from the surrounding materials, and maybe that's why it's gotten a little bit funky. Maybe if we just sort of help blend it in with the surrounding materials, it'll have a greater chance at getting broken down a little bit more quickly rather than just sitting there and festering. All right, so let's kind of reorient this stem the way we found it, because that was the way it was placed in here originally. So I'm going to try to keep returning it back into the bin that way. But then again, if we get back to this corner of defeat again, something else might sort of come into play. But then again, they'll live together. We'll always be able to still count back the number of days it's been since that pumpkin stem was placed in there. This is interesting. The top covering bedding mix here is a little bit dry. So I'm wondering what it is that yeah, okay, now I remember. It was, yeah, that's what it is. The same sort of basic combination of things. Here's another banana peel. And I think the big thing here was a big mound of carrot peels right on top, which in my experience is always something that the worms definitely enjoy and polish off very quickly. So I don't see much orange, but then again, this might be a hint of it right here. The rest of the stuff is, I guess, a piece of coffee filter with the coffee on it. Let's blend that coffee in as long as we're at it. And odds and ends that are indistinguishable from what's around it, other than the very easily identifiable second banana peel. So those things are always pretty easy to spot because of the nature of how it holds together. It's kind of a tough, fibrous material that definitely gets broken down by the worms, and they love it. It just takes them a little while to do so. So at this point, most of the corners are still working on completing their banana peels. But you can see as we gradually get to the newer and newer corners, the banana peels definitely show greater signs of wear. Alright, we've had our fun. Time to give these worms a break. Give them some food. Let them get back to work. And for this feeding, I think I'm going to go kind of big in terms of just the space for it, because I hate the idea of dragging stuff that I bought down here to give to the worms back up into the freezer. And even if it seems like a lot, I'd rather just go for it and give it to them here now, rather than drag it back up and have to stick it back in the freezer. So since it is frozen, I tried to clear all the worms out of the space here. And we'll throw in a little bit of fresh bedding onto which we can place the food. And then hopefully by doing so, we don't, shock any worms with the direct exposure to frozen stuff. My supply of pre-made bedding is it's kind of got two sides of the container, because there's this side that I just replenished recently, and this other side is the side that's kind of aged and ready for use. So I'm going to pull some from this side and leave the other stuff to age a little bit further before we start utilizing it. I'm not going to put this away because I think we'll add a little bit more after we drop in the food. Okay. Like I said, my aim is to give them all of this, so I'm not going to do anything fancy. I'm just dumping it. Okay. Trying to keep things a little bit neat here. So, even though, you and I might look at an apple and think to ourselves, ooh, sweet, juicy, delicious morsel of food, for whatever reason, the worms only begin to agree with that assessment maybe after about a month or something. I mean, sometimes it seems like apple could sit around for a month or more before the worms begin to take an interest in it. So you know what we'll do? See if we can maybe even strengthen the appeal of this feeding by putting a lot of grit on and around it, just for easier consumption. Maybe that's the trick, I don't know. But since I've got a good amount of this stuff, I can be pretty generous, so we'll put it in 2 layers. The stuff down low and the stuff right here on top. And perhaps this will help make the apple become a a faster composting food item than it typically is. Before we cover up, I'd like to just bring back my supply here of pre-made bedding and sprinkle a little bit of this over the top. And you might be thinking to yourself, geez, we just increased the entire volume of this bin by about 20%. And you might be right. Lately I've been pretty generous with the bedding, piling it in, and as a result it seems like I get to the rim of my containers pretty fast. But still, I somehow managed to squeak along for about, 150, 180, 200 or so days sometimes with one of these systems, usually easily squeezing in more than a dozen feedings over that time. So, these systems can definitely help you get rid of a lot of compostable materials, because here worms are eating it. You're not just waiting for microscopic life to do the work. You got actual little beings cruising around, nibbling away, doing away with your stuff. So all we've got left to do here now is to cover up. So we'll bring back this coffee filter. It's been indicating for us the location where we last fed. I guess we've been feeding pretty generously, because a lot of times a piece of paper like this floating around on the top surface might be seen by the worms as a nice little carbon food source to nibble on. So I'm a little surprised to see that there's no holes or anything showing deterioration on that thing. I guess it is possible that we might have recently swapped it out and replaced it, so maybe it's just new and I don't remember. Seems like these little guys were pretty content to hang out here and remain still while we were working. I had this folded in half so they weren't exposed to the light, but now they're not really liking this bright light. So let's continue with the cover up and put these guys away so they don't have to feel like they've got to flee. We're done here anyway. It's just a matter of putting back this plastic covering, which has been doing such a good job keeping the moisture in that I've not felt the need to apply any moisture. So that's pretty cool. And then, since this thing does allow a little bit of light through, the only thing that this cardboard's really doing is keeping things nice and dark so the worms feel at home in here. So, alright, we're done. I've got a little bit of cleanup to do and putting away, but I'm not going to keep you around for that. That's boring. Before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your company. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a quick thumbs up. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Bye now.